The first thing you notice is the smell. It is not one scent but a dense layered tapestry of existence. There is the damp cloying odor of the earthen floor beneath you, a smell of soil that never fully dries. Woven into it is the sour, unmistakable scent of unwashed human bodies, not just your own but those of your wife beside you, your children a few feet away, your parents on the other side of the small room. Their collective exhalations, snores and occasional coughs are a constant rhythm in the dark. Above it all hangs the perpetual ghost of wood smoke from a central hearth, a greasy acrid presence that stings the eyes and coats the back of your throat. It never truly leaves, clinging to the rough wool of your tunic and the straw in your palate. And beneath that faint but sharp is the ammonia tang of livestock, a reminder that the family is, well, take out perhaps a few chickens, often shares this same enclosed space for warmth and security against the night. You are a peasant in the Kingdom of England. The year is 1250 and this single undivided room is not a house. It is your entire world. This sensory immersion is not a fleeting discomfort. It is the fundamental state of being. For the inhabitants of such a world, the modern conception of privacy, of a personal sphere inviolate to the senses of others, was not merely absent, it was structurally, unpsychologically inconceivable. Now, before we unseal these forgotten records, consider this a moment to register your presence. A like serves as your signature and a subscription grants you access to all future findings, provided you believe these stories must be unearthed. And in the comments below we invite you to name the historical figure you believe is most misunderstood. Our analysis of the past is always a reflection as we ask in the present. The time for speculation has passed. Let the shadows gather and we shall now piece together the fragmented clues. To comprehend the medieval peasant's experience, one must first deconstruct the environment that shaped it. The primary sensory input was not visual but olfactory and auditory. The air itself was a medium thick with information. The single-minus room dwelling, typically a C-framed hut of wattle- daub with a thatched roof, was designed for maximum heat retention, not ventilation. A central hearth provided the sole source of light and warmth, but the absence of a formal chimney meant that smoke filtered out slowly through a simple hole in the roof or through the thatch itself. The constant presence of smoke was a biological reality. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from this period frequently reveals evidence of chronic respiratory ailments, a direct consequence of a lifetime spent inhaling particulate matter. Cured meats hung from the rafters, and its chemical properties helped preserve the wooden frame of the house against insects and drought. The air was therefore a tool of preservative as much as it was a medium for breathing. The olfactory landscape was a direct report on the state of the household's ecosystem. The scent of simmering pottage, a perpetual stew of grains and whatever vegetables were available, was a signal of sustenance. The smell of sickness, the specific odors associated with fever, infection, or dysentery, was an immediate and public bulletin of a family member's decline. There was no concealing illness in such an environment. The smell of sweat was the smell of labor and life. The sour tang of spoiled food or damp straw was an alert to a threat against the family's marginal resources. This constant unfiltered stream of smells created a shared consciousness. The individual was never truly separate from the collective because the very air they breathed was a composite of the group's biological and domestic processes. The tactile environment was equally undifferentiated. Floors were typically compacted earth, often strewn with rushes or straw to absorb moisture and waste. This flooring was cold and damp, a constant thermal drain on the body. Bedding consisted of cloth sacks filled with straw or leaves laid directly on the floor or on a simple raised platform. The entire family would sleep in close proximity, not for sentimental reasons but for the practical necessity of shared body heat. In the depths of winter, this communal warmth was a critical survival mechanism, a human hearth to supplement the embers of the fire. This meant the constant physical sensation of another's presence, the nudge of an elbow, the weight of a leg, the breath on one's neck. The boundary of the self was physically porous. Visually, the space was defined by darkness. With the fire banked for the night, the interior of the hut would be plunged into a profound blackness, broken only by moonlight filtering through gaps in the wall or roof. This lack of light fundamentally altered perception. The space was defined not by what could be heard, smelled, and touched. An individual's location was known by the sound of their breathing or the rustle of their straw pallet. The world did not disappear in the dark. It simply transformed into a different sensory map, one based on intimate knowledge of where each body lay. This darkness provided a thin, precarious veil of anonymity, but it was an auditory, not a visual privacy. Every sound was magnified, every movement a potential disturbance to the slumber of the collective. It is within this suffocating, sensory-minus, rich and perpetually public environment that the most private of human acts had to be negotiated. The air was not empty space, it was a dense, shared medium heavy with the weight of everyone you knew. This shared sensory environment was not merely a physical circumstance. It was the architecture of the medieval peasant psyche. The complete and total absence of personal space engendered a psychological state in which the modern concept of the individual self, nurtured by solitude and private reflection, could not gestate. Solitude was not a desirable state to be sought, but a dangerous condition to be avoided. To be alone was to be vulnerable, to animal predators, to human enemies, or most terrifyingly to the temptations of the devil. A person outside the sight and sound of the collective was an anomaly, an untethered element whose thoughts and actions were unmonitored and therefore suspect. The individual's identity was not an internal construct. It was a public fact defined entirely by their functional relationships within the family and the wider village community. You were a son, a husband, a father, a plowman, a parishioner. These roles were your reality, and they were performed continuously on the inescapable stage of the single minus-room hut. This constant low-minus-level surveillance conditioned all behavior. Every act, from the mending of a tool to the consumption of a meal, was subject to observation and implicit judgment. A sigh of weariness, a moment of anger, a flicker of private joy, none of these could be experienced in isolation. They were immediately registered and absorbed into the emotional tenor of the group. This reality necessitated a profound level of emotional regulation, a public masking that was not deceptive but simply normative. The inner life as we conceive it, a private landscape of thoughts, feelings and secret desires, was a luxury that the physical and social structure of peasant life could not afford. Thoughts were given weight only when spoken, and to speak them was to make them communal property. The very language of the period reflects this. Terms for privacy are conspicuously absent from Middle English in their modern sense. The closest equivalents often carried negative connotations of secrecy, conspiracy, or sinful concealment. The desire to be alone was not seen as a need for personal rejuvenation, but as a potential sign of antisocial or heretical intent. This psychological conditioning within the home was reinforced by the social structure of the village. The walls of the hut were physically thin and socially porous. The activities within were the business of the neighbors, the parish priest and the manor court. The surveillance that began at the hearth extended seamlessly into the village square. A marital dispute, an illness, a pregnancy, these were public events discussed, judged and managed by the community. The individual was never truly off minus stage. This created a consciousness where the line between the self and the other was perpetually blurred. One's own state was inseparable from the state of the collective, and personal fortune was inextricably linked to the fortune of the family and village. In such a context, the drive for individual autonomy or self-expression would be not only futile but psychologically destabilizing. Survival depended on cohesion, on the seamless integration of the individual into the larger functional unit. The body itself was not a private possession. It was a resource belonging to a network of obligations. It owed labor to the lord of the manor, it owed its reproductive capacity to the continuity of the family line, and it owed its soul to God, its physical form subject to the strictures of the church. The notion of bodily autonomy, of the right to control one's own physical person free from external intrusion, was an alien concept. This sense of the body as a public entity, a tool for labor and procreation, fundamentally shaped the experience of physicality. Hunger, exhaustion, pain, and illness were not private sufferings but public diminishment tests of the family's collective capacity. Consequently, the most private physical act, sexual union, was burdened by this same lack of ownership. It was not an act undertaken solely for personal connection or pleasure, but a functional duty performed under the implicit gaze of the very social structures. It was a biological imperative occurring within a space where the biological functions of all other family members, sleeping, breathing, coughing, stirring, formed the constant, undeniable backdrop. The mind, conditioned by a lifetime of shared existence, had to find a way to carve out a moment of perceived isolation within a space that offered none. The psychological state of shared existence was a direct product of the immutable physical reality that reasserted itself each night. As the light faded and the day's labor concluded, the single room underwent a functional transformation. Tools were stowed, the fire was banked to preserve precious embers until morning, and the space ceased to be a workshop or kitchen, becoming instead a communal dormitory. This nightly coalescence was not governed by sentiment, but by a rigid unspoken calculus of survival. The arrangement of bodies was a deliberate act of Thermelin's social engineering, a physical map of the family's hierarchy and its vulnerabilities. This was the geography of bodies, a topography of human warmth, plotted against the encroaching cold and darkness. The central and most strategic location closest to the residual warmth of the hearth was reserved for those at the two poles of the life cycle: the very young and the elderly. A newborn infant or a toddler with their poor ability to thermoregulate would be placed nearest the embers, often nestled between the sleeping forms of their parents. Likewise, the family elders, the patriarch and matriarch, occupied this prime territory. Their proximity to the heat source was a physical manifestation of their status and importance to the family unit. Their survival was paramount, as they were the living repositories of knowledge, experience, and tradition. Their placement was an verbal affirmation of the social order. This central core of the sleeping arrangement formed a nucleus of vulnerability and authority around which the rest of the family orbited. Radiating outwards from this core were the other children, arranged roughly by age. The older, more robust children would lie further from the fire, forming an insulating layer between the central nucleus and the colder periphery of the hut. They learned from a young age to huddle together, their small bodies forming a secondary heat source. This arrangement was practical, but it also created a human buffer zone. Any movement or sound originating from the outer edges of the room would have to filter through this layer of sleeping children before reaching the elders at the center. The children in their slumber became unwitting sentinels, their restless movements or sudden cries a potential alarm in the deep silence of the night. On the outermost periphery, nearest the drafty wattle and door walls, lay the able-bodied adults or reproductive age, the very couple whose quest for intimacy forms the core of our analysis. This positioning was logical. They possessed the greatest physical resilience to the cold and damp that seeped through the walls. Their bodies were also the family's first line of defense against any external threat, be it a nocturnal predator or a human intruder. Placing them near the single shuttered entrance made them both a barrier and an early warning system. This peripheral location, however, created a fundamental paradox. While it afforded them the greatest physical distance from the authoritative core of the family, it also subjected them to the greatest physical discomfort and placed them in the most exposed position. Their space was marginal, a frontier between the family's fragile warmth and the hostile warmth and the hostile world outside. This entire human aggregate was often compressed into a single large pallet, a mattress of straw or bracken laid upon a low wooden frame or directly on the rush-covered floor. There were no individual beds, no separate blankets. The family was a single breathing entity under a shared covering of wool or hide. To move was to disturb everyone. To turn over was a collective event, a chain reaction of shifting limbs and rustled straw. The physical boundary of one person's body ended only to meet the beginning of another's. In this tightly configured mass, the concept of personal physical space was an absurdity. The geography of the room at night was not a passive backdrop. It was an active, breathing matrix of risk and witness. With the physical positions of the family members established, the primary obstacle to any clandestine activity became the inescapable auditory landscape. In the profound darkness of the hut site was neutralized, rendering hearing the dominant and therefore most dangerous sense. The night was not a silent void. It was a complex symphony of sounds, a living acoustic map that chronicled the biological state of every inhabitant. For a couple seeking a moment of intimacy, this soundscape was not mere background noise. It was an active surveillance system, a dense field of information that had to be navigated with almost unimaginable precision. To fail was to broadcast their actions to the entire microcosm of their world. The foundational layer of this soundscape was the chorus of human respiration. Each family member produced a unique and identifiable breathing pattern. There was the deep, sonorous rhythm of an exhausted man in profound sleep, the shallower, quicker breaths of a child, and perhaps the wet, catching cough wheeze of an elderly relative. These were the baselines, the steady states against which any anomaly would be instantly perceptible. A sudden intake of breath, a momentary pause, and a familiar, rather more the muffled sound of a sigh would register not as a random occurrence, but as a significant event in the otherwise predictable acoustic environment. The most formidable element within this human orchestra was snoring. While its loud rhythmic drone could potentially mask other more deliberate noises, its unpredictability made it a liability. A sudden snort or a stutter in the pattern could coincide with a rustle of straw, magnifying the tell-stale sound at the worst possible moment. Layered upon the sounds of breathing were the noises of the body at rest. The occasional soft moan of a dreamer, the grinding of teeth, a sharp sniff, or the involuntary smack of lips. Each was a small sharp date, a point in the nocturnal soundscape. The primary instrument of betrayal, however, was the bedding itself. The straw bracken that filled the communal pallet was a highly effective sound-producing medium. The slightest shift in weight, the turn of a hip, the extension of a leg would produce a cascade of rustles and crackles. This sound was impossible to eliminate, only to manage. It required a slowness of movement that was almost geological, a careful distribution of weight learned through a lifetime of shared sleep. The couple had to become masters of a silent anticipating how the straw would react to every micro-minus movement. The structure of the hut itself contributed its own voice to the nocturnal chorus. The dying embers in the hearth would occasionally pop and hiss. During a rainstorm, water might drip with maddening irregularity from a weak point in the thatch onto the earthen floor. The wattle and daub walls contracting in the cold night air could produce subtle creaks and groans. And within those walls and the thatch above, vermin were a constant presence. The faint rapid scratching of a mouse or the bolder scuttling of a rat were familiar ambient sounds. These non-human noises could on occasion provide a brief moment of auditory cover, but like the snoring, their randomness made them unreliable allies. Finally, the sounds from the world outside the hut penetrated the thin walls, completing the auditory landscape. The howl of the wind was a powerful, if inconsistent, masking agent. The steady drumming of rain could create a wall of white noise, a rare and precious opportunity. The distant bark of a fox, the hoot of an owl, or the lowing of the family cow and its adjacent ray were all part of the night's normal vocabulary. A sudden unexpected noise from outside, a branch snapping, an animal cry to close, could cause a sleeper to stir, instantly raising the level of risk within the hut. The couple had to be not only attuned to the internal soundscape but also constantly processing the external one, ready to freeze at any anomaly. This entire acoustic environment demanded a state of hyper-vigilance. Intimacy could not be a descent into private sensation. It had to be an act of supreme and sustained auditory awareness, a silent, terrifying performance on a stage where the audience was asleep but listening with every unconscious breath. In a world defined by sensory saturation and the complete absence of physical boundaries, any attempt at division, however fragile, assumes an outsized psychological importance. For a small subset of the peasant class, perhaps those with a slightly larger dwelling or a spare piece of cloth, a rudimentary partition might be employed. This was not a wall in any modern sense. It was typically a single piece of coarse, loose, woven wool known as woodmal, or perhaps a treated animal hide hung from a ceiling rafter. Its physical properties offered almost no true isolation. It was a visually porous membrane, unable to defeat the darkness but susceptible to betraying movement through the play of shadows from the hearth's embers. It was acoustically transparent, allowing every psyche, often rustle, to pass through its fibers unimpeded. And it was olfactor, absorbent, quickly becoming saturated with the hut's dense amalgam of smoke, sweat, and damp earth. By any objective physical measure, this hanging textile was a failure as a barrier. Its true function was not physical but symbolic. It was an architectural suggestion, a social fiction that all inhabitants of the space tacitly agreed to honor. By hanging the cloth, a line was drawn in the shared environment, creating a here and a there. It did not create privacy, but it did create a zone of designated privacy. This was its profound psychological power. The space behind the curtain was understood to be momentarily separate from the public domain room. Even if it remained fully integrated into the sensory commons, the partition served as a cognitive boundary, a signal to the mind that a different set of social rules, however temporary, was now in effect. For the family members on the other side, it was a cue to intensify their performance of slumber, to consciously ignore the sounds that were in reality impossible not to hear. For the couple seeking intimacy, this flimsy curtain was the entire stage upon which their clandestine act could be performed. Huddling behind it, they entered a space that was psychologically, if not physically, sealed. The illusion of separation it provided was just enough to permit the necessary mental disengagement from the oppressive reality of their surroundings. The cloth swaying gently with the drafts and their own minute movements became a fragile shield against the immediate presence of their sleeping parents and children. It allowed for the creation of a temporary shared secret in a world where secrets were nearly impossible to keep. The act itself was therefore predicated on a collective and spoken agreement. The couple would pretend they were alone and the family would pretend they were asleep. This act of collective pretense was a critical social lubricant, allowing for the fulfillment of a biological and social necessity without shattering the daily norms of communal existence. The curtain was the mechanism that enabled this vital hypocrisy. It transformed an act that would be unthinkable in the open space of the hut into something that could be relegated conceptual elsewhere. The sounds emanating from behind the cloth were not by this social logic the sounds of the daughter minus in minus Lanus Lol and the son in the same room as the patriarch. They were the sounds from a separate cordon minus of space and thus could be cognitively dismissed. The illusion was everything. It did not block the sensory data, but it ray minus contextualized it, allowing it to be processed as something other than what it was. Therefore, this partition cannot be seen as a nascent form of modern privacy. It was rather a sophisticated tool for managing the psychological pressures of its complete absence. It did not offer solitude, but instead created a framework for sanctioned disregard. It was a testament to the human capacity to construct meaning and order through symbols even when the physical reality offers none. The thin, smoky minus smelling roll did not separate bodies. It separated an event from its context, drawing a line not on the floor but through the mind. Given the immense weight of economic imperative and social surveillance, it is tempting to view the procreative act in medieval peasant life as entirely mechanistic, a biological function, stripped of all personal significance, performed under duress. This interpretation, however, risks projecting a modern cynicism onto a far more complex psychological reality. While the external pressures were undeniable and all minus encompassing, they paradoxically created the conditions for the act itself to become a rare, disparate and potent form of self-minus reclamation. Within the suffocating confines of the hut, the clandestine union was not merely a submission to duty. It was a transient moment of anonymity, an ephemeral assertion of an individual existence against the crushing hegemony of the collective. In a life lived entirely in public, where every action was observed and every possession was shared, the creation of a secret was a radical act. The shared knowledge of the encounter, belonging only to the two participants, formed a private world, however small and fleeting. This secret was a form of property that could not be taxed by the Lord, judged by the Lord, judged by the Lord, judged by the priest, or claimed by the family. It was theirs alone. The conspiracy required to initiate and execute the act. The subtle glance, the calculated stillness, the shared hyper-minus awareness forged a bond that was distinct from the public roles of husband and wife. For a few precarious moments, they were not just a functional unit within the family's economic machine. They were co-minus conspirators in a silent personal rebellion. This act of creating and holding a shared secret was perhaps the closest they could come to experiencing a private interior life. Furthermore, the act served as a momentary reappropriation of the body. From dawn until dusk, the peasant's body was a tool. It belonged to the plough, the scythe, the grinding stone, and ultimately to the lord of the manor. It was a vessel for labor, its aches and exhaustion a testament to its utility. In the darkness of the hut, however, in the silent, careful negotiation of intimacy, the body was briefly reclaimed. It ceased to be an instrument of production and became for a moment a site of pure, unmediated sensation. This is not to suggest the act was primarily about pleasure in the modern recreational sense. Rather, it was about experience, the direct tactile sensation of another human being, an experience that was not in service to any external demand, but was an end in itself. In that moment, the body's purpose was not to generate labor value, but simply to be present, to feel. This was a profound, if unconscious, assertion of ownership over one's own physical form. The anonymity afforded by the profound darkness was central to this process. In the light of day, the man and woman were defined by their public identities and the visible hierarchy of the family. He was a son subordinate to his father. She was a daughter minus in minus law, subject to the authority of her mother minus in minus law. Their interactions were governed by a rigid code of deference and respect. But in the pitch-black stripped of these visual markers of status, they were rendered anonymous. They became to unadorned human forms, their identities temporarily erased. This anonymity was a form of liberation. It allowed them to momentarily shed the immense weight of their prescribed social roles and interact on a more fundamental, equal plane. In that darkness, the hierarchy that structured their every waking moment could dissolve, leaving only the immediate reality of their shared physical presence. This reclamation was of course tragically ephemeral. The ultimate purpose and biological outcome of the act served to reinforce the very system from which it offered a fleeting escape. The conception of a child would only deepen their obligations, add another mouth to the collective, and create a new future laborer for the Lord. The moment of individuality was the engine that perpetuated their collective servitude. It was a brief, desperate gasp of air before being submerged once more in the deep, powerful currents of communal obligation. But the existence of that gasp, however brief, is critical. It suggests that even in the most oppressive and public of existence, the human impulse to carve out a small secret space for the self is not just present but essential. The immense internal pressures compelling a peasant couple toward procreation did not operate in a vacuum. They were magnified and enforced by an external force just as powerful and inescapable as the family within the hut, the collective watchful eye of the village. The wattle minus and minus dog walls, so ineffective at blocking sound or smell, were equally porous to social scrutiny. The mandate to reproduce was not a private family objective but a public concern, a matter of critical importance to the stability and survival of the entire community. A couple's fertility, or lack thereof, was not their business alone. It was the village's business, and the village watched, listened, and judged with an intensity born of shared vulnerability. To understand this, one must view the medieval village not as a collection of independent organisms. Each family unit was a cell in a larger body, and failure of one cell could weaken the whole. The open minus field system of agriculture required synchronized communal labor. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting were coordinated efforts, and a family weakened by a lack of able minus-bodied sons could not pull its weight, jeopardizing the collective success of the harvest. Furthermore, the village as a whole owed a collective duty of labor and taxes to the lord of the manor. A family that failed to produce an errand, whose land subsequently went fallow, or was reassigned to outsiders, represented a break in the social and economic fabric, a potential point of weakness in the village's relationship with its overlord. The birth of a healthy child was therefore a victory, not just for the parents, but for the entire community, a reaffirmation of its continuity and a strengthening of its economic base. This collective interest manifested in a system of informal but relentless surveillance. The primary vehicle for this was gossip. In a pre-minus literate society, the spoken word was the dominant medium for information transfer, and the goings on of every household were a subject of constant analysis and discussion at the village, while in the churchyard or at the alehouse. A woman's monthly cycle, while never discussed with clinical precision, would have been implicitly tracked by the other women of the village. A cessation of menses would be noted, and a quiet, watchful period would ensue. A visible pregnancy was a cause for public acknowledgement and speculation, while the continued absence of one in a newly married couple would transition from a matter of private disappointment to one of public concern and eventually suspicion. The church was the formal institutional arm of this surveillance. The parish priest held immense authority, and the doctrine he preached was unequivocal. The primary purpose of marriage in the eyes of God was procreation. The concept of the debitum conjugale, or marital debt, was a theological reality. Husband and wife owed each other sexual access for the purpose of conceiving children, and to refuse this was considered a sin. Through the pulpit and the highly intimate sacrament of confession, the priest could directly inquire into and apply pressure upon the reproductive life of his parishioners. A childless couple might be admonished to pray harder, to undertake a pilgrimage, or to examine their souls for some hidden sin that was causing God to withhold his favor. The church thus sanctified the village's social pressure, framing the biological imperative as a divine command. Public ritual and custom also played a role in reinforcing this communal expectation. Weddings were public affairs, often accompanied by ribald jokes and symbols of fertility. The birth of a child, particularly a son, was a cause for village-wide celebration. Conversely, a couple that remained barren for years would suffer a social erosion. They would be objects of pity, their status within the community subtly diminished. In a world where misfortune was often attributed to supernatural causes, a barren woman might become the target of suspicion, whispered to be cursed, or worse, a witch who had made a pact to remain infertile. The pressure was not just to conform, but to prove one's alignment with the natural God-given order of things. To fail to reproduce was in a sense to be unnatural. Thus the couple lying in the darkness were not only navigating the presence of their sleeping family, they were performing under the weight of the imagined but very real gaze of every neighbor, the priest and the Lord. Their union was a public act, its success or failure a matter for the village ledger. The establishment of a mutual intention to engage in this perilous act could not be achieved through any conventional means of communication. In the hyper-sensitive auditory landscape of the hut, a whisper was as loud and incriminating as a shout. The spoken word, the most basic to love human negotiation, was entirely forbidden. Therefore, the initiation of an encounter required the deployment of a different, far more subtle language, a silent, tactile lexicon developed through shared experience and profound mutual attunement. This was the unspoken agreement, a haptic dialogue conducted in the dark where the slightest pressure or movement carried the weight of a formal proposition. The primary medium for this communication was touch. Living in constant physical proximity, the incidental contact between family members was a constant of life. A leg brushing against another, a hand falling across a chest in sleep, these weren't all meaningless events. The challenge was to imbue a specific touch with deliberate, unmistakable intent, distinguishing it from the random noise of communal slumber. This required the creation of a private coded system. It might begin with a hand not thrown carelessly, but placed with a quiet deliberation on an arm or a shoulder. The pressure would be key, not the dead weight of a sleeping limb, but a faint, sustained tension that signaled conscious will. This initial touch was the opening question. The response to this question determined whether the encounter would proceed or be aborted. A successful protocol was a closed-loop system of call and response. The initiator's subtle pressure was the call. The recipient's reaction was the response, and it had to be just as nuanced. A slight tensing of the muscles, a gentle shifting of weight away from the touch, or simply maintaining a convincingly deep and rhythmic pattern of breathing would serve as a clear, silent refusal. No judgment would be passed. The initiator would slowly withdraw, the question would be erased, and the collective fiction of sleep would remain undisturbed. This system of plausible deniability was crucial. The initial gesture had to be ambiguous enough that if rejected, it could be plausibly dismissed by both parties as an unconscious movement in sleep. If, however, the response was positive, it would come as a mirrored signal. The recipient might answer the sustained pressure of a hand with a slight reciprocal pressure of their own. A leg gently laid against theirs might be met not with withdrawal, but with a subtle acceptance, a lack of resistance, that was itself a form of communication. Perhaps the most definitive signal was a slight controlled shift of weight towards the initiator, a deliberate closing of the small space between them. This was the silent yes. This haptic conversation, taking place over several minutes of charged stillness, constituted the formation of the unspoken agreement. It was a pact made entirely through the skin, a conspiracy confirmed without a single sound wave disturbing the air. This dialogue of touch was supplemented by other sensory channels. Breath, while dangerous, could also be a tool. A conscious, controlled alignment of breathing patterns, moving from the disparate rhythms of individual sleep to a synchronized shared cadence, could be a powerful signal of mutual awareness and intent. It was a way of saying, "I am awake and I know that you are awake." Stillness too was a potent form of communication. Amidst the constant low-level fidgeting under repositioning of a dozen sleeping bodies, a shared protracted moment of absolute motionlessness was a profound anomaly. When two people lay perfectly still beside each other, their stillness a mirror of the other's, it created a pocket of intense shared consciousness in the sea of collective slumber. The cognitive load required to conduct this silent negotiation was immense. This was not an act of spontaneous passion. It was a calculated high-stakes procedure that demanded the full concentration of both individuals. They had to simultaneously monitor the soundscape of the room, maintain the outward performance of sleep for any potentially wakeful family members, and conduct an incredibly subtle coded conversation with each other. This divided attention, this state of being in two places at once, publicly asleep, privately negotiating, was the fundamental psychological state required to even begin the process. The unspoken agreement once reached was not a signal to begin the act itself. It was merely the successful completion of the first and perhaps most difficult phase. It was the confirmation of a conspiracy and agreement to proceed to the next stage, waiting. The unspoken agreement did not trigger an immediate action. It initiated a period of profound shared tension. The wait. This was not a passive interlude but an active strategic state of heightened awareness, a form of cognitive and physiological stasis that was in many ways more demanding than the physical act it preceded. The couple, having confirmed their mutual intent through a silent tactile dialogue, now had to become statues, perfectly feigning the deep slumber their family had hopefully already achieved. Their goal was to outlast the lighter, more easily disturbed stages of sleep in their cohabitants, aiming for a specific optimal window of opportunity. The darkest hour. This hour was not a measurement of time in the modern sense as marked by a clock. It was a biological and environmental state. It was the period typically in the dead of night when the human body enters its deepest and most restorative phase of sleep, known in modern physiology as slow-wave sleep. For the medieval peasant, this was understood through direct empirical observation. It was the time when breathing became slowest and most regular, when the body was least prone to tossing and turning, and when arousal thresholds were at their highest. This was the window of maximum unconsciousness for the potential witnesses. Environmentally, it coincided with the moment of greatest darkness and silence. The fire in the central hearth would have burned down to a bed of glowing smokeless embers, casting no flickering shadows that might betray movement. The ambient sounds of the village would have long since ceased, leaving only the wind and the vast profound silence of the rural night. The process of waiting was an exercise in extreme self-control. The couple lay motionless, their own bodies becoming instruments of both surveillance and potential betrayal. Every natural human impulse had to be suppressed. A tickle in the throat, a sudden itch, a muscle cramp in a leg, any of these could provoke an involuntary movement or sound that would shatter the fragile peace and force the immediate abortion of the plan. They had to consciously regulate their own breathing, mimicking the deep, even rhythm of genuine sleep, a performance that required constant mental focus. They were in effect meditating on the concept of stillness, their minds fully alert within bodies that they forced into a state of suspended animation. Their primary task during this wait was auditory analysis. They were no longer simply inhabiting the soundscape of the hut. They were actively mapping and interpreting it. Their ears strained in the darkness, dissecting the chorus of respiration. They listened for the signature sounds of their parents, siblings, and children. They were waiting for the transition from the irregular, sometimes twitchy patterns of early sleep into the deep, onerous, and most importantly predictable rhythms of profound slumber. The father's loud rattling snore, which earlier might have been a liability, now became a valuable indicator. Once it settled into a steady and broken cadence, it was a signal that his consciousness was deeply submerged. They listened for the cessation of small random noises. The soft moans of a dreaming child, the rustle of a sibling turning over. The goal was to identify a period of acoustic stability, a baseline of deep sleep across the entire human ecosystem of the room. This period of waiting could last for hours. Time itself would seem to warp and stretch, each minute elongated by the tension. The initial desire that had sparked the agreement might cool and recede, replaced by a raw nervous energy. There was the constant, gnawing risk that the window of opportunity might never open. Someone might have a restless night, a child might wake with a cry, or an elder might try to use the chamber pot. There was also the risk that one of the conspirators themselves might succumb to genuine exhaustion and fall asleep, leaving the others stranded in a state of unfulfilled anticipation. The psychological toll of this sustained hyper-vigilance was immense. It was a silent battle of wills waged not only against the sleeping family, but against the very limitations of their own tired bodies and minds. Then at some unknowable point the conditions would align. The breathing of those around them would deepen into a uniform metronomic drone. A profound stillness would descend upon the small room. This was the moment. The wait was over. But the end of the wait marked the beginning of a far more intensive mental process. The calculus of risk, with the decision to proceed now implicitly made, every subsequent micro-movement was governed by a continuous high-speed computation of potential consequences. This was not a conscious deliberative process, but a deeply ingrained instinctual and risk assessment honed over a lifetime of shared existence. The small dark space of the hut transformed from a communal dormitory into a three-dimensional threat matrix, a complex topography of sleeping bodies, where every inch of movement carried a specific quantifiable danger. The couple's minds became cold, efficient processors, constantly mapping their own positions relative to the multiple vectors of potential discovery. The primary and most significant variable in this calculus was their proximity to the family elders. The patriarch and matriarch located near the hearth represented the epicenter of authority. Discovery by them would not be a mere embarrassment. It would be a catastrophic breach of the social and familial order, an act of profound disrespect with severe lasting consequences. The physical distance might be no more than 6 or 7 feet, the length of two sleeping bodies, but it was a gulf charged with hierarchical power. Every movement had to be angled away from this core. A shift in weight, a rustle of straw, had to be executed with a precise understanding of how sound travels across a packed earth floor. The couple had to factor in the known sleeping habits of the elders. Was the father a notoriously light sleeper? Did the mother stir at the slightest noise? Their deep rhythmic breathing was the very signal that created the opportunity, but it was also a baseline against which any new sound would stand in sharp immediate relief. The risk they posed was absolute. The secondary and perhaps more unpredictable set of variables was the children. Scattered between the central hearth and the couple's peripheral position, each child was a potential sensor. Unlike the deep, predictable slumber of an exhausted adult, the sleep of children is often fitful and shallow. A child might wake from a bad dream in need for comfort or a simple physical discomfort. The unpredictable sleep cycles of a young child represented a stochastic variable of the highest order, capable of nullifying all strategic calculations in an instant. A sudden cry would raise the entire household. Furthermore, an older child lying just a few feet away might not be fully asleep. The possibility of a silent, wakeful observer, their eyes open in the darkness, was a source of profound psychological dread. The couple had to proceed under the assumption that they were not merely unheard but also unseen, a faith that could be shattered at any moment. The risk posed by the children was not one of authority, but of pure random chance. The physical environment itself constituted the third class of variables. The straw pallet was the most immediate and treacherous antagonist. Its dry, hollow stalks were designed by nature to amplify sound. The couple had to understand its specific properties, where it was most compressed and silent and where it was loose and likely to crackle loudly. Their movements had to be a study in the slow, even distribution of force. Beyond the pallet, the hut's structure was a source of risk. A floorboard, if they were fortunate enough to have them, might possess a tail-tail creak. The wattle and top walls could transmit vibrations. Even the shared woolen blanket was a potential conspirator, its texture capable of producing a distinct frictional sound if moved too quickly. These environmental factors were constants in the risk equation, a static field of danger that had to be continuously navigated. This constant threaded calculation induced a physiological state of extreme stress. Adrenaline and cortisol hormones associated with fight or flight responses would flood their systems. This created a profound biological paradox. Their bodies were being prepared for explosive action and rapid escape, yet they were required to perform an act of immense slowness and control. Their senses would be unnaturally heightened. Every distant sound, every shift in the room's atmosphere would be magnified. This was the razor's edge on which they operated. The calculus of risk was not a prelude to the act. It was an integral part of it, a silent, terrifying mental framework that governed every breath, every touch, and every carefully managed shift of a limb in the oppressive, watchful dark. Where the risks calculated and the fragile window of opportunity open, the physical execution of the act began. This was not a surrender to passion, but the commencement of a meticulously controlled physical performance, a silent ballet of suppression. The primary objective was not mutual pleasure or emotional release, but the absolute and unwavering orchestration of silence. Every muscle, every nerve ending, every involuntary reflex had to be brought under the dominion of a single overriding command: make no sound. This required a level of kinesthetic awareness and physical discipline that is difficult for the modern mind accustomed to privacy and freedom of movement to fully comprehend. The first and most fundamental challenge was the management of weight. On a communal straw pallet, any rapid shift of mass would telegraph itself through the entire structure, creating a wave of motion and sound that would alert every other occupant. Therefore, movement had to be unthinkably slow. The process of turning to face one another, a simple action that might take a second in a normal context, would here be a protracted event lasting several minutes. It would involve a gradual, almost imperceptible transfer of weight from the hip to the shoulder, a controlled roll, so incremental that the straw beneath would compress rather than crackle. Each individual fibre of muscle had to be engaged in a slow, deliberate contraction, preventing any sudden jerky motions. This was not the dynamic tension of an athlete, but the static, sustained tension of a predator stalking its prey, or in this case a couple stalking a moment of connection. The second layer of control was the suppression of vocalization. The human response to intimacy often involves a range of involuntary sounds. A sigh, a gasp, a moan. In the auditory hothouse of the medieval hut, any such sound would be a catastrophic failure. This necessitated a conscious and continuous act of respiratory control. Breathing had to be kept slow, shallow, and above all silent. The natural impulse to inhale sharply or exhale audibly had to be mastered. This was often achieved by breathing through the mouth rather than the nose, allowing for a more controlled and quieter passage of air. It required a level of focus that bordered on the trance, like a complete dissociation of the mind from the body's natural responses. The physical sensations of the act had to be experienced in a state of enforced silence, the body's testimony ruthlessly censored by the will. The rhythm of the act itself was dictated entirely by this imperative for silence. It could not be driven by passion or instinct. Instead, it had to be a slow, metronomic, and carefully managed motion. The tempo would be dictated by the feedback received from the environment. A slight increase in the rustling of the straw would prompt an immediate decrease in pace, or a complete pause to allow the soundscape to return to its baseline. The couple had to be perfectly synchronized, their movements coordinated to minimize friction in sound. This required a profound non-verbal communication, a shared understanding of pace and pressure, transmitted through touch alone. They were not two individuals acting in concert, but a single limbed organism, moving with a unified, cautious purpose. Finally, there was the management of the shared blanket or animal hide that covered them. This covering, while offering a thin veil of visual privacy, was an acoustic liability. The friction of wool against wool, skin against rough spun fabric could create a distinct whispering or scraping sound. Hands and feet had to be moved with excruciating care beneath this covering. Any adjustment to the blanket had to be done with a slow pull-in motion rather than a quick, minimizing the displacement of air and the resulting noise. They were effectively trapped within a small self-created auditory chamber, where every sound they made was amplified and contained by the very thing that concealed them. The orchestration of silence was a totalizing effort, a complete subordination of the physical self to the demands of the environment. It transformed an active union into a prolonged high-stakes exercise in absolute self-control. The successful orchestration of silence, as detailed in the preceding analysis, induced a profound and paradoxical shift in the sensory experience of the participants. The deliberate and total suppression of sight and self-generated sound did not result in a state of sensory nullification. Instead, it triggered a radical recalibration of the nervous system, with the two dominant external senses effectively neutralized. The remaining channels of perception, touch, smell, and proprioception were forced to compensate, becoming preternaturally heightened. The act was thus transformed from a purely physical union into a deeply internal phenomenological event, an experience defined not by what was happening but by the radically altered way in which it was perceived. The dominant sound was the breath you could not allow yourself to hear. With the auditory channel dedicated almost entirely to external surveillance, listening for the stirrings of family members, the internal world became merely quiet. The absence of sighs, gasps, or spoken words created a cognitive vacuum. Into this vacuum rushed the internal biological sounds of the body, which, while not audible to others, became deafeningly loud in the mind's ear. The frantic percussive beat of one's own heart, the rush of blood pulsing in the ears, these became the powerful rhythmic soundtrack to the encounter. This created a state of profound psychological isolation. Each participant was locked within their own internal soundscape, aware of the other's presence only through non-auditory means. They were together yet utterly alone in their sensory experience of the moment. It was the haptic sense, the sense of touch, that rose to fill this communicative void. With sight and sound removed, the skin became the primary organ of both perception and expression. Every point of contact was imbued with an amplified significance. The subtle variations in pressure, the slight changes in temperature, the texture of skin against skin, these were no longer background sensations, but the very language of the encounter. The tension in a shoulder muscle conveyed a warning, the gentle stroke of a finger communicated reassurance. The skin became an instrument of hearing, reading the silent muscular narrative of the other's body. This was not the generalized, overwhelming pleasure sought in a modern context, but a focused high-resolution stream of tactile data. It was an intimacy of pure information, a connection forged in a darkness so complete that the boundaries of the self defined by sight began to dissolve, leaving only the immediate, undeniable reality of physical contact. The olfactory sense, already saturated by the ambient smells of the hut, became intensely localized. The general miasma of smoke, earthened and washed bodies receded from the conscious mind, replaced by the immediate animal sense of the person beside them. The smell of sweat, of hair, of the faint, unique odor of another human being, these became overwhelmingly present. This was an intimacy stripped of all artifice, a primal connection rooted in the most basic and ancient of senses. Simultaneously, participation. The internal sense of one's own body's position and movement in space became extraordinarily acute. The intense concentration required for slow, controlled movement meant that each participant was hyper-aware of their own physicality. They could feel the precise angle of a joint, the specific engagement of a muscle, the delicate balance of their own weight. This unique combination of sensory deprivation and heightened awareness created a sealed phenomenological vessel around the couple. They had succeeded in constructing a temporary private reality within the inescapable public space. The world outside this vessel, the sleeping parents, the stirring child, the cold draft from the wall, was held at bay not by a physical barrier, but by an act of sheer collective will and focused perception. Inside this fragile bubble, the experience was one of almost unbearable intensity, a silent internal storm of sensation and awareness. It was a union defined by the very things it lacked: sight, sound, and freedom. And in that enforced silence, a connection was forged that was deeper and more desperate than any word could ever express. The internal hyper-sensory world created by the couple was a psychological fortress, but its walls were under constant siege from a single overwhelming fact: the proximal presence of their own parents. The act of procreation, the biological process meant to create the next generation, was being conducted within the immediate sensory sphere of the previous one. This was not a mere inconvenience to be managed. It was a source of profound cognitive dissonance, a stark contradiction between a primal intimate act and the deeply ingrained social and psychological taboos surrounding parental authority and observation. To proceed, the couple had to engage in a sophisticated act of mental partitioning, consciously suppressing a truth that their senses could never fully escape. The most potent source of this dissonance was the presence of the family patriarch. Lying just a few feet away, his sleeping form was more than just a potential witness. It was the physical embodiment of the social order. In the patriarchal structure of medieval society, the father was the locus of authority, the log-reverent judge of the domestic sphere. His approval governed his son's inheritance, his labor, and his standing within the family. From birth, the son was conditioned to a state of deference and respect, a psychological posture that did not simply vanish in the dark. To engage in a sexual act in his father's immediate presence, even if the father was asleep, was a silent but profound violation of this established hierarchy. It was a momentary usurpation of power, a secret assertion of the son's own generative capacity in the very shadow of the man from whom he derived his own existence. The mind, in order to cope with this violation, had to perform a remarkable feat of cyclontation. The son had to mentally cleave the image of his father, the authority figure of his waking life, from the mere physical object of the sleeping man near the hearth. He had to reduce the patriarch to a simple environmental obstacle, an ominous sentient part of the room's topography, like a wall or a piece of furniture. This was a fragile and temporary illusion sustained only by the deepest concentration. Any sound from the father ace, nor that changed in pitch. A sudden cough or mumbled word in sleep threatened to instantly shatter this mental partition, collapsing the psychological distance and flooding the son's consciousness with the full horrifying reality of his transgression. For the woman, the daughter -in-law, the dynamic was different but no less fraught. The primary figure of dissonance for her was the matriarch, her mother -in-law. Having married into the family, her status was often precarious, her identity subsumed into her husband's lineage. The mother minus in minus law was the ruler of the domestic domain, the keeper of its traditions, and the arbiter of a younger woman's worth. The daughter minus in minus law's primary duty was to produce an heir, an act which would solidify her position. Yet she had to perform this duty under the very nose of the woman she was meant to both honor and eventually succeed. The act was simultaneously one of submission to the family's needs and a deeply personal physical event that felt like a trespass on the matriarch's territory. This complex psychological matrix was centered around the hearth. The fire pit was the symbolic and literal heart of the home, the source of warmth, food, and light. It represented stability, domesticity, and the continuity of the family. The parents, as the guardians of this continuity, slept nearest to it. For the couple to engage in the chaotic primal act of sex so close to this symbol of order was a juxtaposition of two powerful opposing forces. It was the wilderness encroaching on the settlement, the raw biological imperative asserting itself within the very nucleus of social structure. The successful navigation of this cognitive dissonance was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire endeavor. It required a mental fortitude that allowed the biological drive to temporarily override the most fundamental and deeply socialized rules of reverence, respect, and hierarchy. In the meticulously controlled environment of the clandestine encounter, where every internal impulse was suppressed and every external sound was monitored, the greatest and most unpredictable enemy was often the very ground upon which the drama unfolded. The straw pallet, the communal bed for the entire family, was not a passive stage. It was an active, malevolent participanted, while hollow and exquisitely sensitive, acoustic instrument designed to betray the slightest deviation from perfect stillness. The rustle in the straw was the constant background threat, the sonic manifestation of risk that could with a single careless movement bring the entire precarious enterprise to ruin. The material properties of straw made it a uniquely treacherous medium. Composed of dried hollow stalks of cereal plants, wheat, barley, rye, or oats, it was brittle and light. When subjected to the slow, even pressure of a sleeping body settling, it would compress with a soft generalized sigh. But when subjected to a point of friction, or a sudden shift in weight, the individual stalks would scrape against each other or snap, producing a sharp, distinct crackle. This sound in the dead silence of the night was as loud and alarming as a breaking twig in a quiet forest. It was a sound that did not belong to the natural vocabulary of sleep, the soft rhythms of breathing, or the occasional wet sound of a cough. It was the sound of deliberate action. Navigating this auditory minefield required a deep empirical knowledge of the palate's specific characteristics. A palate was not a uniform surface. After weeks of use, it would develop a topography of its own. There would be compressed, hollowed minus-out areas where bodies most frequently lay and looser, fluffier regions around the edges. The couple had to have a mental map of this terrain. They had to know which movements would cause a cascade of rustles and which could be absorbed by the more compacted sections. This was knowledge acquired not through conscious study but through the accumulated unconscious data of countless nights spent on the same surface. It was a form of tactile and auditory muscle memory. The primary danger was not the initial movement but the chain reaction it could trigger. A single ill-considered shift of a knee or an elbow could displace a small section of straw, which would then settle, causing adjacent stalks to move. This could create a domino effect, a spreading wave of crackles that was impossible to stop once initiated. The sound of this straw creep was particularly insidious because it was not a single sharp noise but a sustained rustling whisper that seemed to announce their activities to the entire room. To prevent this, their movements had to be not only slow but also imbued with a strange floating quality. They had to learn to move with the straw, to distribute their weight so perfectly that they became one with the palate's natural state of compression rather than an external force acting upon it. The psychological effect of this constant low-level auditory threat was immense. The rustle of straw became the soundtrack to their anxiety. Every soft crackle would trigger a spike of adrenaline, forcing them to freeze their bodies, rigid, their ears straining in the darkness to gauge if the sound had registered with anyone else. They would have to hold this frozen posture for minutes at a time, waiting for the ambient soundscape to return to its normal baseline before daring to move again. The encounter was therefore not a continuous act, but a series of fragmented start-stop moments punctuated by periods of terrifying adrenaline-fueled stillness. The straw was a relentless, impartial judge, its rustle the constant and forgiving verdict on their skill and control. It was the physical manifestation of the fragility of their undertaking, a constant reminder that the boundary between success and catastrophic failure was a single dry stalk of wheat. The extreme physical discipline required to navigate the auditory minefield of the straw palette and the intense psychological focus needed to maintain the illusion of separation had a profound stripping effect on the nature of the act itself. It was by necessity a function stripped of all ritual. The modern culturally constructed edifice of love making, an event imbued with romantic preliminaries, emotional expression and affectionate aftermath, is a historical anachronism when applied to this context. In the suffocating darkness of the peasant hut, the union of man and woman was reduced to its most elemental biological core. A perfunctory high-risk and silent procedure undertaken for the specific purpose of genetic transfer. The concept of foreplay as a period of mutual exploration and escalating intimacy was structurally impossible. The true prelude to the act was not a series of tender gestures but the tense, silent and terrifying negotiation conducted through coded pressures and controlled breathing. It was a prelude not of affection but of conspiracy and risk assessment. Every moment was fraught with danger, leaving no temporal or psychological space for the leisurely development of arousal. The imperative was to achieve the biological objective as quickly and silently as possible, not to prolong the experience for its own sake. The environment ruthlessly pruned away any action not directly contributing to the final functional goal. The act itself was similarly mechanistic. As previously analyzed, its rhythm was dictated not by passion but by the acoustic properties of straw and the sweeping patterns of nearby family members. It was an instrumental act, a means to a very specific end. This functional perspective was not simply a consequence of the physical environment. It was reinforced by the dominant theological framework of the era. The Church, through the teachings of theologians like Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas, had long posited that the sole legitimate purpose of sexual intercourse within marriage was procreation. While pleasure was not always seen as inherently sinful, it was viewed with deep suspicion of potentially dangerous byproduct that could lead the soul astray. The concept of the debitum conjugal, either marital debt, framed the act as a duty and obligation to be fulfilled. This theological lens provided an external divine justification for the very functionalism that the physical circumstances demanded. The couple were not merely being practical, they were being pious. Consequently, the climax of the act was not a shared peak of emotional unphysical release in the modern sense. It was the tense, silent conclusion of a dangerous task. The objective was not mutual satisfaction, but the successful deposition of seed achieved without waking the patriarch. The moment of orgasm itself had to be ruthlessly suppressed, any involuntary muscular contraction or sharp intake of breath a potential betrayal. It was a climax experienced internally, a biological event that could have no outward expression. Its success was measured not in pleasure but in silence. Perhaps most tellingly, the environment precluded any possibility of a post-coital phase of intimacy. There was no room for the languid, affectionate stillness that often follows the modern sexual act. There could be no whispered words, no gentle stroking of hair, no shared moment of quiet connection. To engage in any such behavior would be to needlessly prolong the period of maximum risk. The immediate aftermath of the biological climax was therefore not a gradual descent into peaceful slumber, but a rapid, tense and silent disengagement. The goal was to revert to the state of feigned sleep as quickly and seamlessly as possible, erasing any physical evidence of the secret that had just been shared. The unspoken agreement to begin the act was mirrored by an unspoken agreement to end it with a cold functional finality. The function was complete. The ritual was absent. The functional finality of the biological act did not bring resolution. It brought the moment of greatest peril. The brief, silent flurry of controlled movement was over, but its acoustic signature, however faint, now hung in the air, a ghost of a disturbance seeking a listener. The aftermath was therefore not a descent into relaxation or a shared moment of relief. It was a sudden, absolute and terrifying cessation of all motion. This was the frozen aftermath, a period of rigid enforced stasis where the couple transformed from conspirators into statues, their bodies locked in a desperate performance of profound slumber, while their minds raced with a singular primal question: have we been discovered? This state was a profound physiological contradiction. The body, having just undergone a physically demanding and psychologically stressful event, was flooded with a cascade of neurochemical adrenaline cortisol, priming it for a fight minus or minus flight response. The heart rate would be elevated, the breathing shallow and rapid, the muscles tense and trembling with residual energy. Yet the external reality demanded the exact opposite. The first and most difficult task was to consciously seize control of these involuntary biological responses. The couple had to actively will their hearts to slow a futile but mentally all-consuming effort. More critically, they had to master their breathing, forcing the ragged, shallow gasps of exertion back into the deep, slow and metronomic rhythm of sleep. This was a silent internal war waged between the panicked animal body and the disciplined, calculating mind. During this period of forced stillness, which could stretch for an eternity of subjective minutes, their sense of hearing, already heightened, became their entire universe. They were no longer listening for the opportunity to act, but for the consequences of their actions. Every ambient sound in the hut was subjected to a frantic forensic analysis. Did the father's steady snore just falter for a second? Was that a soft cough from the children's side of the room, or just the house settling? Did the matriarch just shift her weight on the pallet, the rustle of straw sounding like a thunderclap in the charged silence? Their ears strained to detect any deviation from the established baseline of collective sleep, any anomaly that might signal aroused consciousness. In this frozen state, they were utterly alone. The brief, intense physical connection was severed with a brutal finality. There could be no reassuring touch, no shared glance in the dark, no whispered confirmation of safety. To offer any such comfort would be to create a new sound, a new risk. They lay side minus by minus side, perhaps only inches apart, but they were as isolated as if they were opposite ends of the earth. Each was trapped within their own skull, wrestling with their own racing pulse and their own specific fears. The man might be consumed by the terror of his father's potential discovery, while the woman might be paralyzed by the thought of her mother minus law's knowing silence in the morning. The shared secret that had united them moments before now became a source of profound individual isolation. Only when a sufficient period of uninterrupted silence had passed, a duration judged by instinct, not by time, could the slow, painstaking process of tactical retreat begin. This was not a simple rolling apart. It was a controlled millimeter by millimeter disengagement, a reversal of the careful approach. Each limb would be withdrawn with the same geological slowness, each movement calculated to produce the absolute minimum of sound and motion. The goal was to return to their original neutral sleeping positions, erasing any physical evidence of their union. They had to create a plausible scene of normalcy, a domestic tableau that would bear the scrutiny of the morning light. The frozen aftermath ended not with a clear signal of all clear, but with a gradual grudging subsidence of acute terror into a state of dull, exhausted anxiety. Only then, with the silence holding and the breathing of their family remaining a steady, oblivious chorus, could their own minds finally release their iron grip, allowing their stressed bodies to succumb to a genuine and deeply troubled sleep. The arrival of dawn in the medieval hut was not a gentle, gradual awakening, but a harsh, functional transition. The first thin grey light filtering through the smoke hole, or the chinks in the wattle and daub walls, was a signal not for personal reflection, but for the immediate resumption of labor. The fire would be rekindled from its embers, filling the small space once again with smoke and the smell of pottage. The sounds of sleep would be replaced by the sounds of the day. The lowing of the cow needing to be milked, the cries of a hungry infant, the gruff monosyllabic exchanges of a family preparing to face another day of toil. Within this abrupt shift from the nocturnal to the diurnal world, the intense silent drama of the preceding night was subjected to a powerful and necessary social mechanism, a collective unspoken amnesia. As the family members rose from the communal pallet, their interactions would be defined by a studiously maintained normalcy. The son would address his father with the customary deference, seeking instructions for the day's work in the fields. The daughter law would attend to her morning chores under the watchful eye of her mother law, their exchange limited to practical necessities. There would be no knowing glances, no subtle changes in tone, no lingering tension in the air that might betray the events that had transpired in the darkness. To acknowledge the night's intimacy, even through the most infinitesimal, non-verbal cue, would be to shatter the carefully constructed social order upon which their collective survival depended. It would be an admission of a secret, and secrets were a destabilizing force in a world that demanded total transparency. This amnesia was not a sign of indifference or a lack of emotional depth. It was a sophisticated and essential social strategy, a form of cognitive adaptation to the impossible conditions of their existence. To live in such proximity required the ability to consciously and collectively disregard certain categories of information. The family had to operate as if the night and the day were two separate, disconnected realities governed by entirely different sets of rules. The nocturnal world, with its darkness, anonymity, and primal biological urges, was a space where the unspoken could occur. The diurnal world, governed by light, hierarchy, and labor, was a space where those occurrences were rendered non-existent. The transition between these two states had to be absolute and seamless. So the couple at the center of the event, this performance of normalcy, was the final and perhaps most challenging phase of their conspiracy. After the extreme intimacy and shared vulnerability of the night, they now had to treat each other as they would on any other day, as functional partners in a domestic economy. They had to erect a wall of public propriety between them, becoming strangers to the very secret that bound them together. This required a level of emotional compartmentalities that is difficult to fathom. The memory of the shared risk, the heightened sensations, the silent communication, all of this had to be locked away in a private mental chamber, inaccessible during the waking hours. This collective forgetting was in essence the final act that made the entire endeavor possible. It was the closing of a loop, the societal ratification of the illusion of separation that the flimsy wall curtain had only symbolized. By refusing to acknowledge the act, the family and the couple themselves retroactively granted it a form of privacy. The event was relegated to the realm of the unspeakable and therefore, in a functional sense, to the realm of the private. Morning's collective amnesia was the social contract, the attenuation of the biological contract. It was a testament to the immense human capacity to construct a workable reality through a shared silent agreement to ignore the impossible truth of their lives. The day was for labor, the night and everything that happened within it was to be forgotten. The collective amnesia performed at dawn was a masterful piece of social theater, but it was just that. A performance. To assume that the other inhabitants of the hut were truly oblivious to the nocturnal encounter is to underestimate the acuity of human senses when honed by a lifetime of proximity. The silence that filled the room in the morning was not the empty, placid silence of ignorance. It was the heavy, charged, and deeply complex silence of knowing. This feigned ignorance was not a psychological void, but a conscious, active state of complicity, a shared and unspoken agreement to not know what is in fact known. This complicity was the invisible psychological architecture that supported the entire social structure of the family. The most sophisticated performance of this ignorance was given by the family elders. The patriarch, whose deep sleep was the very condition that enabled the act, was not a fool. His consciousness, even in slumber, would have been attuned to the specific rhythms of his domestic environment. An anomalous series of rustles, a subtle shift in the room's tension, these were data points that his sleeping brain would register. Upon waking, his choice was not between knowing and not knowing, but between acknowledging. To acknowledge the act would be to confront a transgression against his authority that occurred under his own roof. This would necessitate a response, punishment, admonishment, which would destabilize the delicate family hierarchy. Far more strategically advantageous was to feign total ignorance. This silence was a portal of power. By not speaking, he gave his tacit, unofficial sanction to an act that was vital for the family's continuity, while simultaneously preserving his official authority, which remained theoretically breached. His silence said, "I permit this for the sake of an heir," but it did not happen. The matriarch's complicity was perhaps even more nuanced. As a woman, she would have possessed a deep experiential understanding of the biological and social imperatives driving her to minus law. She too had once been the young wife in this exact scenario, performing the same duty, under the watchful sleeping ears of the previous generation. Her silence was therefore layered with a kind of grim empathy, but it was also to love control, by knowing and by allowing her minus law to know that she knows she established a silent and spoken debt. The younger woman's future status, which would be elevated by the birth of a child, was now implicitly conditional upon the mother minus law's continued silence. It was a subtle but powerful way of reinforcing her own position as the female head of the household. Her silence said, "I know what you did to fulfill your duty, and you will remember that I allowed it." For the other occupants, such as older siblings or adolescent relatives, the feigned sleep was a form of social apprenticeship. They were learning the rules of adult life by observing this silent drama. They learned that certain essential acts are to be conducted under a veil of secrecy and are never to be mentioned in the light of day. They learned the critical social skill of selective inattention. For a young unmarried sibling, lying nearby, the sounds from the darkness might be a source of confusion, curiosity, or even a dawning, frightening comprehension of the future that awaited them. Their decision to remain still and feign sleep was their first lesson in participating in the collective fiction, their entry into the adult world of necessary hypocrisy. This widespread complicity was made possible by the ambiguous nature of the evidence. No one saw anything. The knowledge was based entirely on auditory fragments. A rustle of straw that lasted too long, a subtle change in a breathing pattern, a period of charged stillness that felt different from normal sleep. This ambiguity was crucial. It provided every participant with a layer of plausible deniability, both to others and to themselves. They could all tell themselves that the sounds could have been something else. A rat in the thatch asleep was cropped the wind. The silence of knowing was not a confrontation with a hard fact, but a collective turning away from a highly probable inference. It was the unspoken unified decision to not connect the dots, a conspiracy of willful disregard that was the essential unseen lubricant of the medieval family machine. The elaborate social theater of feigned ignorance and collective amnesia was a high-stakes performance precisely because the consequences of failure were so severe. The system of silent complicity was not maintained out of politeness. It was a carefully constructed dam holding back a flood of potential social and familial chaos. Discovery in this context did not mean being caught in the act by a fully awakened observant witness. The threshold was far lower. Discovery could be a single ill-timed and unambiguously deliberate sound, a muffled cry, a sharp gasp that was too loud to be plausibly denied. It could be an older child who out of innocence or malice mentioned in the morning light that they heard noises. Any event that punctured the fragile bubble of collective denial would constitute a discovery, and its price would be immediate and devastating. The first and most immediate consequence would be a profound and public humiliation for the couple. In a society where individual identity was subsumed into the collective shame, was not a private feeling but a public status, a stain upon one's honor that affected the entire family. To have their most private act exposed would be to be rendered naked, not just physically but socially. They would become the subject of village gossip, their moment of intimacy transformed into a crude and comic story told at the alehouse. This was not a minor embarrassment. In the small closed world of the medieval village, a reputation was a tangible asset, and to have it damaged could have long-term repercussions on their social standing and their interactions with their neighbors. Within the family unit, the consequences would be even more dire. The carefully maintained hierarchy would be shattered. For the son, discovery by his father would represent an act of unforgivable disrespect, a violation of the patriarch's authority within his own domain. This could result in a range of punishments, from a physical beating, a common and accepted form of paternal discipline, to a more lasting, undamaging withdrawal of favor. The father might withhold his blessing, delay the transfer of land, or otherwise undermine his son's economic future. The filial bond based on a lifetime of deference would be irrevocably damaged, replaced by a lingering resentment and mistrust. For the woman, the price of discovery by her mother in law would be a catastrophic loss of standing. She would be seen as clumsy, indiscreet, and perhaps even wantonly lustful, failing in the crucial task of performing her duty with the required silent modesty. Her daily life, already one of subservience, would become a living torment. She would be subjected to constant criticism, increased workloads, and the cold and yielding disapproval of the woman who controlled her domestic existence. The fragile transcational relationship would be stripped of all pretense, revealing the raw power dynamic beneath. Furthermore, a public discovery would invite the intervention of the church. The parish priest, upon hearing of such an indiscreet event through the channels of village gossip or the confessional, might see it as his duty to intervene. The couple could be subjected to public penance, forced to stand in the church porch in a white sheet, for instance, to atone for their shamelessness. The act itself was not sinful within marriage, but to perform it in a way that caused public scandal was. The sin was not one of lust but of indiscretion. The most corrosive consequence, however, would be the destruction of the unspoken agreement that allowed life to function. Once the veil of ignorance was torn, it could not be easily mended. The family would be forced to live in the harsh light of a known truth, their daily interactions poisoned by the memory of the exposed event. The necessary fictions that smoothed the rough edges of their existence would be gone, leaving only the raw, unbearable reality of their proximity. This was the ultimate price of discovery. Not a specific punishment, but the total breakdown of the psychological mechanisms that made their life together tolerable. It was this terror that fueled their extreme caution, this understanding that a single uncontrolled sound could bring the entire fragile structure of their world crashing down. For weeks and perhaps months following the successful undiscovered act, the intense drama of the night would recede, replaced by the mundane rhythms of agricultural life. The shared secret would lie dormant, a silent, unacknowledged memory between the husband and wife. But the biological purpose of the encounter, if fulfilled, would inevitably begin its slow, inexorable journey from the private to the public sphere. The biological manifestation of that secret pregnancy was a process that no amount of social fiction or collective amnesia could permanently conceal. Its eventual revelation was the final and most profound stage in the life cycle of the clandestine act. The initial signs would be subtle private knowledge held only by the woman. A missed menstrual cycle, a change in appetite, a new sensitivity to the pervasive smells of the hut. These were the first secret signals from her own body. For a time this knowledge was hers alone, a solitary, anxious and hopeful state of awareness. She was the sole custodian of the biological outcome, her body the vessel in which the family's future was gestating. This period of private knowledge was a brief and unique form of personal power in a life that afforded very little of it. She knew and no one else did. Soon, however, the secret would have to be shared with at least one other person, her husband. This confirmation would likely occur in the same way. The initial act was negotiated not through a direct spoken announcement, which was too risky and too direct for such a momentous topic, but through a series of subtle coded cues. A specific lingering glance, a subtle shift in her daily routine, perhaps even a shared acknowledgement during another furtive nocturnal encounter. The confirmation of the pregnancy transformed the original secret of the act into a new shared secret of its consequence. The conspiracy for two was renewed, now focused not on the risk of discovery but on the hope for a successful birth. As the pregnancy advanced, the secret would begin to broadcast itself through involuntary physical signs. A slight swelling of the abdomen, episodes of morning sickness that could not be entirely concealed in the close quarters, a palpable weariness. These were public data points. It is at this stage that the silence of knowing among the other family members would emerge, but with a different tenor. The feigned ignorance of the matriarch and other women in the household would slowly transform into a state of watchful knowing support. They would not speak of the pregnancy directly, for to do so would be to acknowledge its specific illicit point of origin. Instead, they would begin to make subtle accommodations. The pregnant woman might be tacitly excused from the heaviest lifting, or a small extra portion of pottage might be left for her. These were acts of silent acknowledgement, a collective unspoken recognition that the biological imperative was being fulfilled. Finally, the pregnancy would reach a stage where it was physically impossible to ignore. The swollen belly was a public declaration, a biological fact that superseded all social fictions. This moment of undeniable visibility marked the final transition of the secret. It was no longer a private matter nor a silent shared knowledge. It was now a public fact, communal asset belonging to the family and by extension the village. The clandestine act, conceived in darkness, risk and a desperate search for anonymity, had now produced the most public and visible of all possible outcomes. The community, which had silently pressured the couple to fulfill their duty, could now openly celebrate the result, its origins tactfully and permanently forgotten. The child once born would be the living embodiment of the collective amnesia, a product of a specific, dangerous and private moment, but celebrated as a purely communal triumph, its genesis laundered by the passage of time and the undeniable reality of its own existence. The birth of the child was the final, irrevocable publicizing of the secret. This event, like the conception that preceded it, did not occur in a private, unattached space. It took place within the same sensory commons in which the family lived and slept. The process of labor was a public affair, managed not by a physician but by the elder women of the family and perhaps a neighboring midwife. The sounds of the mother's pain, the smells of blood and birth were not concealed. They were immediately absorbed into the hut's dense atmosphere, becoming shared knowledge for every inhabitant, including the other children. The arrival of the newborn was therefore not a gentle miracle, but a visceral and communal event, a stark biological reality unfolding on the public stage of the earthen floor. With the first cry of the infant, the meticulous and fragile equilibrium of the household was permanently shattered. The hut did not physically expand, but it was forced to recalibrate every one of its internal systems, spatial, economic, and social, to accommodate the new presence. The first and most immediate challenge was spatial. The geography of bodies, the established nocturnal arrangement of the family, had to be redrawn. The infant, possessing the least ability to regulate its own body temperature, now claimed the most valuable real estate in the hut, the position closest to the hearth's residual warmth. This displaced the elders, who in turn shifted their position, causing a domino effect of spatial renegotiation that rippled outwards to the periphery. The entire sleeping arrangement was compressed, the density of human bodies within the finite container of the hut increasing. The small, almost non-existent buffer of personal space between individuals shrank even further. Economically, the new child represented a profound paradox. It was the family's single most important long-term asset, a future laborer and the key to their security in old age. In the short term, however, it was a severe liability. It was another mouth to feed in an economy of perpetual scarcity. The family's meager agricultural output did not increase with the child's birth, meaning the existing inadequate resources had to be stretched even thinner. The mother's milk was the only new resource, a critical and miraculous provision in a world of limits. But its production required that the mother herself be adequately nourished, placing a further strain on the family's food supply. The child was a biological investment that required the family to go into a form of immediate nutritional debt, hoping for a future dividend of labor that was by no means guaranteed, given the terrifying rates of infant mortality. The birth also recalibrated the family's labor economy. The new mother, occupied with the constant demands of nursing and infant care, was temporarily removed from her other duties. Her labor in the fields, at the grindstone, at the loom, had to be redistributed among the other members. The mother -in-law and older female children would absorb a significant portion of this deficit. This created a new web of dependencies and obligations, subtly altering the power dynamics within the household. The new mother's value had increased by producing an heir, but her immediate utility as a laborer had decreased, making her simultaneously more powerful and more dependent. Socially, the recalibration was absolute. The daughter -in-law, who may have previously held a tenuous position, was now, upon the birth of a healthy child, especially a son, fully integrated into the lineage. She had fulfilled her primary function. Her relationship with her mother -in-law could now transform from one of pure subservience and scrutiny into a more complex alliance based on a shared interest in the survival of the next generation. The patriarch, seeing his line secured, would have his authority reaffirmed. The infant immediately became the new center of the family's entire survival strategy, the focal point of its hopes and its most profound anxieties. The hut had not simply expanded by one person. Its very purpose had been reoriented around the tiny vulnerable form by the fire. The infant, now established as the new gravitational center of the household, was more than just a biological addition. It was the newest participant in an ancient and broken cycle. Its birth was not the end of the story that began with a silent tactile agreement in the dark. It was the beginning of the story's next recitation. From its first breath, the process of its social and psychological conditioning began immediately, ensuring that it would one day perform the same role as its parents. This was the generational echo, the process by which the extreme and peculiar norms of the single-room existence were transmitted not through instruction, but through a total and inescapable sensory immersion. The infant learned the fundamental lesson of shared existence before it learned to speak. It never experienced solitude. There was never a moment of silence, never a space that was its own. Its sleep was constantly interrupted by the movements and sounds of a dozen other people in the room. Its waking hours were spent in the arms of its mother, grandmother, or older siblings, its body in constant contact with another. The boundary between self and other, a concept that in other go through experiences of separation and individuality, was he rendered permanently porous from birth. The child's developing consciousness was not that of an individual, but of a collective, with its own biological rhythms inextricably enmeshed with the larger organism of the family. Its acclimatization to the dense auditory environment was total. The symphony of snores, coughs, and muffled movements that constituted the nocturnal soundscape was not a disturbance to the infant. It was its lullaby, the normal and expected state of the world. Within this acoustic training was a more subtle lesson. As the child grew, it would lie on the pallet, a small sleeping obstacle, in the same threat matrix its parents had once navigated. It would be an unconscious witness to the next generation of clandestine encounters, perhaps its own parents trying again, or an older sibling who had recently married and brought their spouse into the crowded hut. The soft anomalous rustles in the straw, the periods of charged stillness, these would be absorbed into its subconscious, filed away as a normal if mysterious part of the nocturnal world. As the child transitioned into adolescence, this unconscious awareness would sharpen into a dawning unspoken comprehension. Lying awake in the darkness, it would eventually learn to interpret the sounds, to connect the dots that everyone else had silently agreed to ignore. This was the crucial stage of its apprenticeship in the silence of knowing. It would learn to feign a deeper state than it felt, to control its own breathing, to become an inert part of the landscape so as not to betray its awareness. In doing so, it was not merely protecting the conspirators. It was practicing the very skills of suppression and self-minded control it would one day need. The observer, in turn, was destined to become the protagonist. The final turn of the cycle would come with the child's own marriage. Now a young adult lying on the periphery of the room with their new spouse, they would be possessed of a complete intuitive undersystem. They would know the calculus of risk, the language of touch, the treachery of the strand, the critical importance of feigned ignorance in the morning. The entire brutal and necessary procedure was already encoded in their being, a form of hereditary knowledge, passed down through the very air and architecture of the hut. When they reached out a hand in the darkness to make their own silent tactile proposition, they would not be inventing a method. They would be activating a pattern. They would be echoing the actions of their parents before them, a single desperate act of procreation and individuality that in its very performance ensured the perfect continuation of the system that demanded it. The generational cycle so perfectly calibrated to perpetuate itself within the hermetically sealed world of the single-room hut appears from the inside as a law of nature, an immutable, uneternal condition of human existence. But it was not. The entire complex system of sensory management, silent negotiation, and collective amnesia was not a fundamental aspect of the human psyche. It was a highly specialized and ultimately fragile adaptation to a specific technological and economic reality. An architectural environment devoid of internal divisions. The world we have meticulously reconstructed over the preceding chapters was not undone by a shift in morality or a sudden desire for solitude. It was rendered obsolete by a set of mundane material innovations. The corridor, the internally partitioned house, and most symbolically the simple, solid, close-fitting door. This architectural revolution did not begin in the peasant's hovel. Its origins lie in the changing domestic arrangements of the aristocracy and the rising gentry class in the late medieval and early modern periods. For centuries, the elite household had functioned as a scaled-up version of the peasant hut. The Great Hall was the central functional space where the lord's family, his retainers, and his servants sat, worked, and often slept in a public communal hierarchy. Privacy was a function of status, not of architecture. The lord might have a private access was often directly from the Great Hall, still tying it to the communal space. The Great Rebuilding of England, other parts of Europe roughly spanning from the mid-16th to the mid-17th century, saw a fundamental shift in this philosophy. Wealthier landowners, influenced by new ideas of comfort and domesticity, began to build houses with a radical new conception of interior space. They began to build rooms with specific dedicated functions. A dining parlor, a kitchener with drawing room, and most importantly, individual bedchambers. The key technological innovation that made this functional differentiation possible was the corridor. Before its widespread option, rooms in a large house were typically arranged in file, a demeaning one had to pass through a series of rooms to get to the next. This made every room a thoroughfare inherently public. The corridor created a separate neutral channel for movement, allowing rooms to be accessed independently. This seemingly simple invention had a profound social and psychological effect. A room could now be a destination, not a passageway. It could be entered in, then it could be sealed. The door was its mechanism. The lock was its guarantee. The door fitted snugly into a frame was a piece of social technology more revolutionary than any siege engine. It was a physical manifestation of a new idea, the right to be separate. It allowed for the control of sensory access. A closed door was a barrier against sight. A wall-made one was a significant baffle against sound. It was a declaration that the space behind it and the person within that space was temporarily withdrawn from the public commons. This physical separation provided the necessary container for the gestation of a new kind of self, the modern private individual. Behind the closed door, one could read a book, write a letter, or engage in a conversation without being seen or heard. It was in these sealed chambers that the concept of an inner life or landscape of private thoughts and feelings distinct from one's public role could be cultivated. This new domestic architecture and the psychological state it engendered slowly began to trickle down the social hierarchy. A prosperous yeoman farmer building a new house would emulate the gentry, including a separate parlor and upstairs bed chambers. The single-room hut of the landless peasant or cottage persisted for centuries longer, but it was now viewed through a different lens. It was no longer the normative state of existence. It was a symbol of poverty and the lack of civilization. The invention of the door did not simply change the way houses were built. It fundamentally categorized the human experience, creating a new and powerful division between the public and the private. The world of the peasant hut, once the totality of reality, was now an anachronism, a dark, undivided space, against which the new world of light, order, and privacy would define itself. The invention of the door and the partitioned home did not simply change the physical layout of a house. It created the architecture for a new kind of human consciousness. The ghosts that haunt the wattle-door walls of the medieval hut are not supernatural entities. They are the specters of this older pre-private self. To understand the inhabitant of that world is to understand the mentally externalized, porous and rooted in the collective. It was a self defined not by an internal monologue but by a continuous public performance of one's designated role. This externalized self was forged in the crucible of constant observation. In a world without privacy, one's identity was not a matter of internal reflection but of public utility and reputation. You were what you did and what others saw you do. Your worth was measured in your labor, your fertility, your deference to the hierarchy, and your conformity to communal norms. The rich private interior world of personal feelings, secret ambitions, and nuanced self-analysis, the very things the modern self takes as its core, was a barren landscape. There was neither the space, the time, nor the cultural framework to cultivate it. Thoughts and feelings had no true existence until they were spoken, and to speak them was to make them public property subject to communal judgment. The primary psychological axis was therefore not guilt, a private reckoning between the self and its conscience, but shame, a public state of disgrace before the eyes of the community. The greatest fear was not of sinning in secret but of being discovered. This self was also physically and psychologically porous. Its boundaries were as permeable as the wattle walls of the hut. The individual breathed in the smoke the sickness and the biological reality of their entire family. They absorbed the collective mood, their own emotional state, inseparable from the tenor of the group. This was not a choice. It was an unavoidable condition of sensory saturation. The modern notion of the self was a sovereign bounded entity, a discrete, looking out at the world from a protected internal fortress, was an impossible fiction. The medieval peasant self was more akin to a single indistinct cell in a larger breathing organism, its own survival and identity entirely dependent on the health and function of the whole. This constant immersion in the collective produced a consciousness that was intensely focused on the present. The mind was a tool for immediate practical problem-solving. Reading the weather, judging the health of an animal, calculating the risks of a nocturnal encounter. It was not a space for leisurely introspection or the abstract analysis of one's own motivations. Life was a series of concrete urgent tasks, and survival depended on an unwavering focus on the here and now. The past was a repository of tradition and grievance, the future a source of fear and hope, but the present was the only operational reality. And so when we look back at the dark, crowded and suffocating world of the single-room hut, we are not merely observing a different set of living conditions. We are bearing witness to a different way of being human. The ghosts in the wattle are the echoes of a self that was undivided from its community, a consciousness that knew no solitude. That world, with its brutal intimacy and its total lack of separation, is gone. But the psychological structures it forged over countless generations represent a foundational layer of human experience, a subterranean river of collective consciousness that still flows silently and invisibly beneath the foundations of our own private rooms. And so our detailed examination of this sealed world concludes. We have walked through the dense sensory landscape, navigated the silent high-minus-stakes conspiracies, and borne witness to the powerful social fictions that made life possible in the undivided space. We have traced the journey of a single secret act from its inception in darkness to its public manifestation in the light of a new day, and we have seen how that cycle was destined to repeat a perfect engine of self-minus perpetuation. In the end, the story of the peasant hut is the story of the invention of its opposite. Privacy. We now view privacy as a fundamental human right necessity for a healthy psychological life. But this account reminds us that it is also a modern and perhaps fragile luxury. It is a gift bestowed upon us by architecture, by the corridor, the partition, and the door. In gaining these private spaces, we gain the freedom to cultivate a rich interior world, to become the complex individual selves that we are. But it is worth asking in the final quiet moments before sleep what might have been lost. The world of the hut was a prison of inescapable proximity, but it was also a world of absolute unbreakable cohesion, of a shared consciousness that we can no longer imagine. Our private rooms are our sanctuaries, but they can also be our cells of isolation. The peasant knew no loneliness, only the suffocating, and perhaps sometimes comforting weight of the collective. The account is finished, but it leaves behind a question. How thin really is the line between the civilization they knew and the one we have built? Sleep on that.